Hello and welcome! In this video we are going to learn how to install and configure Entity Framework Core in an ASP.NET Core web application. Given that web applications are one of the most popular application types that utilize Entity Framework, we are going to use a web application for this and the following videos to come. Before we get started, we need to install the Entity Framework Core package first. For this tutorial, I'm going to use .NET Core 3.0, so we are going to use Entity Framework Core 3.0 as well. Let's install the package. After the package is installed, in the project folder I have created a folder named DLA, Data Access Layer, and inside there is a class for our DB context, Entity Framework Core DB context. In order to create a DB context, our Entity Framework Core DB context class needs to inherit from the DB context class found in the Microsoft.Entity Framework Core namespace. To configure Entity Framework Core, we have two options. We can configure it inside the DB context itself or as a service from our startup.cs class using the service provider. To configure Entity Framework Core inside the DB context, we need to override the onConfiguring method. Inside here, we can use the option builder to specify our connection string and other options. For now, we are just going to specify the connection string. In my case, I am using Microsoft SQL Local DB. For database name, I am providing EF Core Tutorial, and also I am using Windows Authentication. As we can see, use SQL Server method is not found. That's because Entity Framework Core specifies all its DB providers into separate NuGet packages. In order to use SQL Server, we need to install the appropriate NuGet package. Let's head back to our package manager and install Entity Framework Core.SQL Server. Once the package is installed, our error should go away. As we can see, the error has gone and we have configured our Entity Framework Core DB context. Now, let's test this out. In the controllers folder, I have a controller named EF Controller just to test out the Entity Framework Core DB context. In the createAction method, we are going to create a new instance of our DB context and call database.ensureCreated method, which will make sure that our database is created if it's not already. Let's start our application and call the API. Before we run the code, let's make sure that our database does not exist yet. In the Microsoft SQL Management Studio, we are connected to Microsoft SQL Local DB, and as we can see, there are no DBs created yet. Once we run the code, this will make sure that our DB has been created. Let's head back to the SQL Management Studio and see if our database has been created. After a refresh, we should see our database created here. As I mentioned previously, there were two ways of configuring Entity Framework Core DB context. The other one was to register it as a service in the service provider. Let's head to our startup.cs class and in the configure service method we are going to add the following code: services.addDB context and provide our DB context class and use the same useSQL server method and provide our connection string inside. Once we run the application, we are going to encounter an error. That's because our DB context needs to have an extra constructor in order to make this work. Let's head back to our DB context class and insert the constructor. This constructor takes in a parameter of DB context options with a type of Entity Framework Core context. And this will be passed to the base so it knows how to configure itself. If we are going to configure it as a service, we need to delete the onConfiguring method we overrode here because the useSQL server inside the onConfiguring method will override our other connection string passed from the service registration. Now that we have added a constructor with parameters, we need to go back to our Entity Framework controller and remove the following code because we don't have a parameterless constructor anymore. Since we registered our DB context as a service, we can now inject it into our controller. After that, the service provider will create an instance of our Entity Framework Core DB context and pass it inside our controller, which we can just use. A final step is to remove the hard-coded connection string we use in the startup.cs class. To make this better, we need to place the connection string in our app.settings and use it from there. Let's go to app settings and add our connection string. I'm giving mine a name of default connection, but you can give yours any name and provide the connection string here. Now that we have added a connection string in our app settings, we can go back to our startup.cs and change the hard-coded connection string to receive it from the app settings. That's it for installing and configuring Entity Framework Core in an ASP.NET Core web application. We'll dive into other aspects of Entity Framework Core in the videos to come. Thank you for watching.